Black teen helps elderly woman push a cart home. Weeks later, he receives an envelope that changes everything. The police siren pierced through the autumn afternoon in Oakwood Heights, its wailing echoing off the pristine facades of million-dollar homes. 15-year-old Jamal Richardson instinctively tensed, his hands gripping the handles of an elderly white woman's shopping cart. Through the corner of his eye, he caught neighbors peering through their curtains, phones ready to dial 911. The woman, Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, stood firmly beside him, her steel gray eyes challenging the approaching patrol car. "This young man is helping me, Officer Wilson," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of her former years on the federal bench. "Or is kindness now a crime in our neighborhood?" That moment would change everything, though neither Jamal nor Mrs. Thompson could have predicted how their simple encounter over a stuck shopping cart would unravel decades of corruption, expose a web of injustice, and ultimately redefine the meaning of family. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can unlock the most heavily guarded secrets, and in Oakwood Heights those secrets ran deeper than anyone dared to imagine. Hey beautiful souls, before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. And if you're ready for an inspiring journey, hit that like button. At 15, Jamal Richardson already carried the weight of responsibilities far beyond his years. Living in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Oakwood Heights with his mother, Sarah, he was the man of the house since his father Marcus's imprisonment 8 years ago. Despite their struggles, Jamal maintained a 4.0 GPA at Roosevelt High School and earned first-chair saxophone in the school band, achievements that seemed miraculous given their circumstances. Sarah Richardson worked double shifts as a hospital custodian, her calloused hands telling stories of endless hours scrubbing floors and sanitizing rooms. Despite her exhaustion, she never missed Jamal's band performances, sitting proudly in the back row still wearing her work uniform. The other parents would whisper and stare, but Sarah held her head high, knowing her son's talent would speak louder than their prejudices. The absence of Marcus Richardson haunted their small family like a persistent shadow. Convicted of drug trafficking in what many considered a rushed trial, Marcus had always maintained his innocence. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but in a system stacked against men of color, his protests fell on deaf ears. Jamal visited his father monthly at Sterling State Penitentiary, their conversations growing more strained as the years passed, but never losing the underlying current of love and shared pain. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson's story stood in stark contrast to the Richardsons', yet carried its own burden of tragedy. As one of the first female federal judges in the state, she had built a reputation for fairness and integrity over her 30-year career. Now retired, she lived alone in her Victorian mansion on Preston Hill, surrounded by antiques and memories. Her son, Michael Thompson, served as the district attorney, his political ambitions matched only by his ruthless pursuit of convictions, a fact that had driven a wedge between mother and son. What few knew was that Eleanor Thompson carried a deep regret from her final years on the bench. A series of drug trafficking cases had crossed her court, cases that now, in retirement, seemed to show troubling patterns. But every time she tried to investigate, obstacles appeared, documents vanished, and witnesses became suddenly unreachable. Detective James Barrett of the Internal Affairs Division had been watching the Oakwood Heights courthouse for years. A quiet, methodical investigator with 20 years' experience, Barrett had noticed disturbing connections between certain cases and Michael Thompson's rapid rise to power. But proving corruption in a system designed to protect its own proved nearly impossible. The community of Oakwood Heights itself was a study in contrasts. Multi-million-dollar homes lined streets named after civil rights leaders, while just blocks away, families struggled to make rent. The wealthy residents spoke proudly of diversity and inclusion at charity galas, while their security systems automatically flagged suspicious individuals, almost always people of color, walking through the neighborhood. These parallel worlds might never have intersected if not for a stuck shopping cart and an act of kindness. But beneath the surface, unseen threads connected them all. Eleanor Thompson had presided over Marcus Richardson's trial, though neither Jamal nor his mother knew this yet. Michael Thompson had personally prosecuted the case, using tactics that would later haunt his mother's conscience. And Detective Barrett had just discovered a pattern of falsified evidence that led straight to the DA's office. In his small bedroom, Jamal practiced his saxophone late into the night, the music floating out over the neighborhood like a bridge between worlds. From her study, Eleanor Thompson often heard these melodies reminded of her late husband who had played in jazz clubs before becoming a civil rights attorney. And in his pristine corner office, Michael Thompson worked to maintain his carefully constructed world of power and influence, unaware that it was about to unravel all because a teenage boy decided to help an elderly woman with her groceries. The stage was set for a story that would shake Oakwood Heights to its foundation, forcing everyone to confront the truth about justice, redemption, and the power of unexpected connections. But on that autumn afternoon, it all began with a simple act of kindness and a stuck shopping cart. Oakwood Heights wore its history like an ill-fitting designer suit, expensive on the surface but straining at the seams. The neighborhood had transformed over the decades from a middle-class melting pot into an exclusive enclave where old money families clutched their pearls and property values with equal ferocity. Manicured lawns and restored Victorian mansions told one story, while the security cameras and neighborhood watch signs whispered another. The community's transformation began in the 1990s when developers discovered its potential. Original residents were slowly priced out, their modest homes replaced by modern monuments to wealth. Only a few holdouts remained, mostly elderly residents protected by rent control, watching their familiar world disappear beneath fresh coats of paint and pretension. Eleanor Thompson's Victorian mansion stood as a bridge between these two worlds. Unlike her neighbors' renovated showplaces, her home retained its original character, complete with creaking floorboards and stories etched into every corner. The library, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, held volumes of legal documents alongside first-edition novels. But hidden within these shelves were files cases that had troubled her conscience, including one labeled simply Richardson, 2015. The Richardson case had seemed straightforward at first: a maintenance worker caught with a significant quantity of drugs in his work van. The evidence appeared solid, the confession obtained according to protocol. But something about Marcus Richardson's unwavering claims of innocence had nagged at Eleanor. By the time she noticed the inconsistencies in the police reports, the case had concluded and her retirement was looming. The local courthouse where Eleanor had presided for 3 decades now bore her name on a brass plaque, though she rarely visited. The building's Greek Revival architecture projected authority and justice, while its shadowy corners harbored secrets that could destroy careers and reshape lives. In her final years on the bench, Eleanor had begun noticing patterns: cases rushed through the system, evidence processed with suspicious efficiency, and a disturbing correlation between conviction rates and certain officers' promotions. The social fabric of Oakwood Heights was woven with invisible lines of power and privilege. The country club hosted weekly gatherings where business deals and political alliances were formed over golf and martinis. Michael Thompson moved effortlessly through these circles, his charm masking a calculating ambition. His rise from assistant district attorney today had been meteoric, each promotion coinciding with high-profile convictions that made headlines and earned political capital. Detective Barrett's investigation had revealed troubling connections. A disproportionate number of drug convictions involved minority defendants, most represented by overworked public defenders. Evidence handling procedures showed irregularities, particularly in cases prosecuted by Michael Thompson. But proving misconduct required more than patterns; it needed witnesses willing to speak up in a system designed to silence them. The wounds of racial tension in Oakwood Heights ran deep beneath its progressive veneer. The community newsletter proudly announced diversity initiatives, while security patrols increased their presence in concerning areas. Local schools touted inclusion programs while maintaining subtle barriers through expensive extracurricular requirements and optional parent donations. Sarah Richardson navigated this landscape daily, cleaning the homes of people who would never invite her to sit at their tables. She worked for a cleaning service that catered to Oakwood Heights' wealthy residents, her uniform a badge of invisibility that allowed her to witness their unguarded moments. She overheard conversations about property values declining when families like hers moved into nearby apartments. She saw the sidelong glances when she showed up at school functions still in her work clothes. Yet within this complex web of prejudice and power, small acts of resistance bloomed. Eleanor Thompson's friendship with her African-American housekeeper had endured decades. The local music teacher, recognizing Jamal's talent, provided private lessons in exchange for him tutoring younger students. And a growing number of younger residents had begun questioning the status quo, inspired partly by national conversations about justice reform. These were the currents running beneath the surface of Oakwood Heights when Jamal Richardson and Eleanor Thompson's paths crossed currents that would soon rise up and sweep away decades of carefully maintained facades. The late September sun cast long shadows across Preston Hill as Jamal helped Mrs. Thompson push her cart toward her Victorian home. The weight of his saxophone case pressed against his back, a familiar comfort amid the unfamiliar tension of being watched. Curtains twitched in adjacent houses, and a woman in designer athleisure quickened her pace as she passed them, clutching her purse tighter. "Don't let 'em bother you," Mrs. Thompson said quietly, noticing Jamal's discomfort. "Their prejudice speaks volumes about them, not you." Her voice carried the same authoritative tone that had commanded courtroom respect for 3 decades, though Jamal didn't yet know her background. They had just reached the ornate iron gates of Mrs. Thompson's property when the police cruiser rounded the corner. Officer Wilson, a veteran of the Oakwood Heights force known for his proactive patrolling of the neighborhood, slowed to a stop beside them. His partner, a younger officer named Rodriguez, looked uncomfortable as Wilson rolled down his window. "Everything all right here, Mrs. Thompson?" Wilson's tone was professionally concerned, but his eyes never left Jamal. "We received a call about a suspicious person in the area." Before Mrs. Thompson could respond, a small crowd had begun to gather. Among them was Catherine Preston, head of the neighborhood association, iPhone raised as she recorded the interaction. Her presence added another layer of tension to the scene. She had recently led a campaign to increase security patrols in response to changing demographics in nearby areas. "Officer Wilson," Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through the murmurs of the gathering observers, "I assume you're here because someone reported this young man helping an elderly woman with her groceries. Is that what passes for suspicious activity in Oakwood Heights these days?" The confrontation might have ended there if not for Michael Thompson's timely arrival. His black BMW pulled up behind the police cruiser, his presence commanding immediate attention. He emerged in his perfectly tailored suit, every inch the successful district attorney, though his expression darkened seeing his mother in what he perceived as a compromising situation. "Mother," he called out, striding toward him. "I got a call from Catherine about a disturbance. Is everything okay?" His concerned son act was perfect, but those who knew him well would have recognized the calculated gleam in his eyes. What happened next would be recounted differently by various witnesses. Mrs. Thompson, still standing her ground, turned to face her son. "Michael, how convenient of you to arrive. Perhaps you'd like to explain to young Mr. Richardson here why helping an elderly woman warrants police intervention in our neighborhood." The mention of the name Richardson caused a subtle shift in Michael Thompson's demeanor. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Jamal more carefully. "Richardson? Any relation to Marcus Richardson?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with unspoken implications. Jamal straightened his spine, years of his mother's coaching on how to handle authority figures kicking in. "He's my father, sir." The tension in the air thickened. Officer Wilson's hand unconsciously moved closer to his weapon, while Catherine Preston's iPhone captured every moment. Mrs. Thompson looked between her son and Jamal, a dawning recognition in her eyes that would later prove crucial. "Well," Michael said smoothly, "given the circumstances, perhaps we should have a discussion about appropriate boundaries in our neighborhood. Mother, I'm sure Mr. Richardson has other places to be." But Mrs. Thompson had spent too many years observing human nature from the bench to miss the undercurrents in this interaction. "The only discussion we need to have, Michael, is about why a simple act of kindness has drawn such an audience. Mr. Richardson will help me with my groceries, as he kindly offered to do. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." Her words carried the weight of decades of legal authority, but they also sparked something else, a small act of rebellion against the carefully maintained social order of Oakwood Heights. In that moment, standing between her son and a young man who reminded her too much of other young men who had stood before her bench, Eleanor Thompson made a choice that would set in motion events she couldn't possibly have anticipated. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the police cruiser pulled away, neither Jamal nor Mrs. Thompson realized they had just lit a fuse that would eventually expose decades of corruption, challenge deep-rooted prejudices, and forever change the fabric of their community. For now, they simply had groceries to deliver, while the autumn wind carried away the last echoes of their confrontation. Inside Mrs. Thompson's Victorian mansion, time seemed to move differently. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across hardwood floors that had witnessed decades of history. As Jamal helped put away the groceries, his eyes were drawn to the baby grand piano in the corner of the living room, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light. "Do you play?" Mrs. Thompson asked, noticing his interest. When Jamal shook his head, she smiled. "But you're musical, aren't you? I've heard saxophone music floating through the neighborhood in the evenings. That's you, isn't it?" Before Jamal could respond, his gaze fell on something that made his heart skip a beat: a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a younger Mrs. Thompson in judge's robes, standing outside the very courthouse where his father had been sentenced. The realization hit him like a physical force. "You," he started, his voice caught between accusation and confusion. "You were the judge in my father's case." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Mrs. Thompson moved to her leather armchair, suddenly looking every one of her 73 years. "Yes," she said simply. "I was hoping we'd have more time before this came up." What followed was a conversation that would haunt them both. Mrs. Thompson spoke of a trial that had never sat right with her, of evidence that seemed too neat, of a confession that came too easily. She told Jamal about the questions she'd started asking after her retirement, and the strange resistance she'd encountered. "Your father's case wasn't the only one," she explained, moving to her study where files lay scattered across an antique desk. "There were others, all following the same pattern, all prosecuted by my son, all involving defendants from minority communities, all with evidence handled by the same group of officers." Jamal stood in the doorway, his mind racing. "Are you saying my father's innocent? That he was set up?" "I'm saying," Mrs. Thompson chose her words carefully, "that there are irregularities that deserve investigation. But powerful people don't like their actions questioned, even when those questions come from a retired federal judge." The implications of her words hung in the air between them. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the study's walls. In his pocket, Jamal's phone buzzed with messages from his mother, wondering where he was. "Why are you telling me this?" he finally asked. "Why now?" Mrs. Thompson moved to her bookshelf, pulling out an old leather-bound volume. "Because sometimes, Jamal, justice needs witnesses. What happened outside today, that wasn't just about a shopping cart. My son's reaction to your name wasn't coincidence. There's a bigger story here, one that's been waiting to be told." She opened the book, revealing hollow pages filled with documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. "I've been gathering evidence, but I'm not as young as I used to be. And after today, I suspect time might be running out." The sound of a car door slamming outside made them both jump. Through the study window, they could see Michael Thompson's BMW parked in the driveway. Mrs. Thompson quickly returned the book to its shelf. "You should go," she said urgently. "Use the back door." But Jamal, she caught his arm as he turned to leave. "Come back tomorrow after school. There's more you need to know." And she hesitated. "Bring your saxophone." As Jamal slipped out through the kitchen door, he could hear Michael Thompson's voice in the foyer, demanding answers about the afternoon's events. The tension in his voice suggested this wasn't a simple social call between mother and son. Walking home in the gathering dusk, Jamal's mind whirled with questions. His father's face, seen through prison visiting room glass, seemed to hover before him. 8 years of visits, of promises to make him proud, of trying to believe in his innocence despite what everyone said. Now suddenly everything he thought he knew was shifting. The weight of his saxophone case felt different on his shoulder, no longer just carrying an instrument, but potentially the key to something much bigger. What had started as a simple act of kindness was transforming into something far more complex and dangerous. As streetlights flickered on along Preston Hill, Jamal made a decision. Tomorrow he would return. Tomorrow he would learn the truth. Tomorrow everything would change. Jamal's kindness and courage deserve a like, but sadly, not many people have shown their support yet. If you believe in standing up against prejudice, hit that like button for him. The next afternoon, Jamal's saxophone melody drifted through Mrs. Thompson's study, a haunting rendition of Strange Fruit that made her hands tremble as she sorted through old case files. She hadn't expected such depth from someone so young, such understanding of pain translated into music. "You're playing," she said when the last note faded. "It reminds me of my late husband, Thomas. He played in jazz clubs to pay for law school. Back then, they wouldn't give scholarships to a black man, no matter how brilliant he was. She moved to the piano, lifting its dusty cover. He taught me to appreciate how music speaks truths that words sometimes can't. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. Jamal would arrive after school, ostensibly for piano lessons Mrs. Thompson had insisted on teaching him, discovering he had a natural talent. But between scales and arpeggios, they pieced together the puzzle of Marcus Richardson's case. The neighborhood's reaction to their growing friendship was predictably mixed. Catherine Preston's neighborhood watch group began documenting Jamal's daily visits. Anonymous complaints about noise disturbance started flowing into the police department, though Officer Wilson could hardly cite someone for playing classical piano. "Let him talk," Mrs. Thompson would say, her steel gray eyes twinkling with defiance. Sometimes the best way to fight prejudice is to simply continue doing what's right. But the situation escalated when Michael Thompson arrived unannounced one afternoon. He stood in the doorway of the music room, watching his mother guide Jamal's hands over the piano keys, his expression unreadable. "Mother," he said finally, "we need to talk. Alone." The conversation that followed in Mrs. Thompson's study was heated. Through the closed door, Jamal could hear Michael's controlled anger. "Do you have any idea how this looks? The judge who sentenced his father now playing house with the son." Playing house, Mrs. Thompson's voice was sharp. "I'm teaching a talented young man piano, Michael. Something your father would have appreciated if you'd bothered to remember anything he taught us about justice and equality." "This isn't about justice," Michael hissed. "This is about appearances. I'm up for state attorney general, and I can't have my mother consorting with." "With what, Michael? Say it." "With the son of a man you helped put away." The silence that followed was deafening. Later that evening, as Jamal packed up his saxophone, Mrs. Thompson handed him an envelope. "Your father's case files," she whispered. "Copies I made before certain documents disappeared. Keep them safe, but don't open them yet. The time isn't right." But fate had other plans. That night, as Jamal walked home clutching the envelope, a police cruiser pulled up beside him. Officer Wilson stepped out, his partner conspicuously absent. "Need a ride home?" Son, the words were friendly, the tone was not. "No thank you, sir, I'm almost there." Insisting on refusing police assistance could be seen as suspicious behavior. Wilson's hand rested casually on his weapon. "Why don't you show me what's in that envelope?" The confrontation might have ended badly if Detective Barrett hadn't chosen that moment to drive by. He pulled over, his unmarked car's lights flashing once. "Everything okay here?" Wilson Barrett's casual tone carried an edge of authority. "Mrs. Thompson called. Asked me to make sure her student got home safely." Wilson hesitated, then retreated to his cruiser with a forced smile. "Just offering community assistance, Detective. You know how it is." As Wilson drove away, Barrett turned to Jamal. "You're playing a dangerous game, son, but you're not playing it alone. Keep that envelope safe. And tell Mrs. Thompson, tell her the investigation is making progress." That night, practicing his scales in his bedroom, Jamal realized there was no turning back. The music had become more than notes on a page. It was becoming a bridge between worlds, a way to speak truths that needed to be heard. Outside his window, the lights of Oakwood Heights twinkled like stars, each one holding secrets waiting to be revealed. What none of them knew was that Michael Thompson was already making moves of his own, setting in motion events that would shake their world to its foundation. The first sign of trouble came on a Monday morning at Roosevelt High School. Principal Harris called Jamal into his office, his normally friendly demeanor replaced by grave concern. On his desk lay a printout of Jamal's latest drug test, mandatory for all band members. It showed positive for cocaine. "This must be a mistake," Jamal protested, his heart pounding. "I've never touched drugs. You know that his perfect record, his scholarship applications, his father's imprisonment, everything flashed before his eyes." "I want to believe you," Jamal Harris sighed, "but the evidence is clear, and given your family history, the board is particularly concerned." He slid a suspension notice across the desk. 2 weeks pending further investigation. Word spread through the school like wildfire. Teachers who had praised Jamal's work just days before now avoided eye contact. His saxophone was removed from the band room for safekeeping. Even his closest friends started keeping their distance, as if criminality might be contagious. Sarah Richardson arrived at the school still wearing her custodial uniform, her face a mask of controlled fury. "My son doesn't do drugs," she insisted, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "This is about his visits to Mrs. Thompson, isn't it?" Principal Harris shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Richardson, I understand your concern, but the test results—" "The test results are fabricated," a new voice interrupted. Eleanor Thompson stood in the doorway, leaning on her cane but radiating authority. "And I can prove it." The room fell silent. Principal Harris's face paled slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, this is a private matter." "A private matter involving systematic harassment of a minor." She moved into the room, placing a folder on his desk. "These are the testing protocols for your school district. Notice anything interesting about the lab that processed Jamal's sample?" Harris opened the folder, his frown deepening. "Thompson Diagnostic Services." "My son's company," Eleanor confirmed, "one of his many investments. Curious timing, wouldn't you say?" But before the implications could sink in, Michael Thompson himself appeared, flanked by 2 police officers. "Mother," he said smoothly, "I thought I might find you here. Officers, please ensure that all parties maintain a reasonable distance from Principal Harris. We wouldn't want anyone feeling pressured." The scene that followed would be remembered differently by everyone present. Sarah standing protectively in front of her son. Eleanor Thompson facing down her own flesh and blood. Principal Harris caught between duty and doubt. And Jamal, watching it all, suddenly understanding why his father had always told him that the system was designed to break people, not protect them. "This isn't over," Eleanor declared as they left the office. "Jamal, come to my house this evening. Bring your mother. There's something you both need to see." But when they arrived at the Victorian mansion that evening, they found the front door ajar. Inside, the study had been ransacked. The hidden compartment in the bookshelf stood empty, its contents scattered or stolen. On the piano lay a single sheet of music, Strange Fruit, with a message scrawled across it, "Stay in your lane." Detective Barrett arrived within minutes of being called, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. "This wasn't a random break-in," he muttered, photographing the scattered papers. "They knew exactly what they were looking for." Eleanor Thompson stood among the chaos of her study, her expression determined rather than defeated. "They didn't find everything," she said quietly. "Some truths can't be silenced, no matter how hard they try." As they left that night, Jamal looked back at the grand old house, its windows dark against the evening sky. The suspension notice felt heavy in his pocket, but something else had awakened in him, a determination that went beyond anger or fear. "Mom," he said as they walked home, "I need to tell you something about Dad's case." Sarah Richardson took her son's hand just as she had when he was small. "I know, baby. Mrs. Thompson already told me. And it's time we did something about it." Above them, storm clouds gathered over Oakwood Heights, promising a change in the weather. But the real storm was just beginning. The next 2 weeks unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of pressure. Jamal's suspension coincided with a series of random health inspections at the hospital where Sarah worked. Citations appeared for violations that hadn't existed during previous inspections. Sarah's supervisor, apologetic but firm, reduced her hours due to budget constraints. At Roosevelt High, someone broke into Jamal's locker and planted marijuana, a clumsy attempt quickly discovered by Detective Barrett, who had taken to monitoring the school's security feeds. The band teacher, Mr. Collins, quietly passed Jamal sheet music and practice recordings, defying the administration's ban on student contact during suspension. "They're trying to break us down systematically," Eleanor explained one evening, as she and Sarah sat in her kitchen while Jamal practiced piano in the next room. "It's a technique I've seen before: isolate, pressure, discredit. But they've made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" Sarah asked, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "They've given us nothing left to lose." Eleanor pulled out a burner phone Barrett had provided. "And people with nothing to lose are dangerous to those with everything to hide." They began gathering evidence meticulously. Sarah, still working reduced hours at the hospital, noticed certain rooms being used after hours by well-dressed men who never appeared on patient records. She photographed license plates, documented times and dates. One of those plates belonged to Judge Harrison, who had taken over many of Eleanor's cases after her retirement. Jamal, banned from school but not from his after-school job at the local music store, started recognizing faces. The same officers who'd been present at his father's arrest were frequent visitors to a back room at Oakwood Heights Country Club, where Michael Thompson held his campaign strategy meetings. But the pressure continued mounting. Anonymous calls to Child Protective Services suggested Sarah was neglecting Jamal. Their apartment's maintenance requests went mysteriously unfilled, leaving them without heat as autumn temperatures dropped. Catherine Preston's neighborhood watch group photographed everyone who visited their home, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance. Eleanor's health began showing signs of strain. Her hands trembled more frequently, and her breathing became labored during their evening strategy sessions. Yet she refused to slow down, working late into the night reviewing old case files, connecting dots that had eluded her on the bench. "Your father wasn't the only one," she told Jamal one evening, spreading documents across her piano. There were dozens of cases, all following the same pattern. Drug charges based on evidence from the same officers, processed by the same lab, prosecuted by Michael with unusual speed. The defendants were always minorities, always from struggling backgrounds, always represented by overworked public defenders. The pattern was clear, but proving it seemed impossible. Key documents had vanished from court records. Witnesses had moved away or refused to talk. The few who might have spoken were still in prison, their appeals mysteriously stalled in the system. Then came the break-in at the music store. Jamal arrived one morning to find the place ransacked, his beloved store's saxophone destroyed. But the real target became clear when he checked the store's hidden security camera installed by Barrett weeks earlier. The intruders had spent most of their time searching the back room where Michael Thompson's associates held their meetings. "They're getting nervous," Barrett said, reviewing the footage, "making mistakes. But that makes them dangerous. You need to be careful, all of you." That same week, Sarah found her car's brake lines cut. Eleanor's housekeeper discovered suspicious packages in her mailbox. Even Mr. Collins received an anonymous letter suggesting his teaching methods might need review. The tension reached a breaking point when Jamal, walking home one evening, noticed he was being followed. Two men in a black SUV, trying to look inconspicuous but failing. He ducked into the music store, heart pounding, and called Barrett. "Stay where you are," the detective ordered. "I'm 5 minutes out." But when Barrett arrived, he found more than a scared teenager. Jamal, hidden in the store's storage room, had recorded the men's conversation as they searched for him. Their words, caught clearly on his phone, implicated both Michael Thompson and several high-ranking police officers in what appeared to be a massive drug distribution network. "The kid knows too much," one man had said. "Boss says he's becoming a liability like his old man." "Make it look clean," the other replied. "Like father, like son, another Richardson making bad choices." Barrett immediately moved Sarah and Jamal to a safe house, while Eleanor refused to leave her home. "Let them come," she said, her voice steel beneath the weakness. "I've got a few surprises left." That night, as Jamal lay awake in the unfamiliar safe house, he could hear his mother crying softly in the next room. The sound stirred something in him, not fear, but a deep, burning resolve. He took out his phone and began typing, documenting everything he remembered, every detail that might matter. His father had always told him that music was about timing, knowing when to play and when to stay silent. Now, watching the cursor blink on his screen, Jamal realized the same was true of justice. They had the evidence. They had the witnesses. All they needed was the right moment to break their silence. That moment would come sooner than any of them expected, and it would change Oakwood Heights forever. The transformation in Oakwood Heights was subtle at first, like the first few notes of a symphony building toward crescendo. Eleanor Thompson's reputation as a former federal judge still carried weight, and whispers of her investigation began circulating through country club lounges and PTA meetings. Some residents, particularly younger families who had moved to the area for its schools rather than its status, started asking questions. Sarah Richardson, despite the attempts to discredit her, found unexpected allies among her hospital co-workers. Nurses who had witnessed suspicious late-night meetings began sharing their observations. A janitor who had worked there for 30 years provided access to maintenance logs showing patterns of after-hours activity coinciding with major drug busts in the area. Detective Barrett's investigation gained momentum as more officers, disgusted by the corruption they'd witnessed, came forward anonymously. Each piece of evidence revealed a sophisticated operation. Drugs seized in raids weren't being destroyed but redistributed, with profits flowing through a maze of shell companies connected to Michael Thompson's campaign donors. The pressure on Jamal's family intensified, but so did community support. Mr. Collins organized a petition demanding Jamal's reinstatement, gathering signatures from students, parents, and even some school board members. Local music stores offered him practice space and instruments. Small acts of kindness emerged from unexpected places: anonymous grocery deliveries, paid utility bills, letters of encouragement. Eleanor's health continued declining, but her determination never wavered. She spent hours with Jamal, not just teaching piano, but sharing her knowledge of the legal system. Understanding the law, she would say, is like understanding music. It's not just about the notes written on the page, it's about the spaces between them, the rhythm, the context. Sarah found herself evolving from a cautious, hard-working mother into a fierce advocate. She organized meetings with other families affected by suspicious drug convictions, creating a support network that grew larger each week. Her quiet dignity in the face of harassment earned her respect even from some of Michael's supporters. Jamal's own transformation was perhaps the most profound. The scared teenager who had simply helped an elderly woman with her groceries was becoming someone else, someone stronger, more focused. He practiced piano with renewed intensity, understanding now that music could be both a refuge and a weapon. "Your father used to say that jazz was born from pain but speaks of hope," Eleanor told him during one lesson. "What we're doing now, it's the same thing, taking something broken and making it into something beautiful and true." The evidence they gathered painted a damning picture. Michael Thompson's rise to power had been built on a foundation of false convictions and seized assets. The drug trade hadn't decreased under his tough-on-crime policies, it had simply been reorganized under his control. Each wrongful conviction added to his conviction rate, while eliminating potential witnesses. But proving it meant confronting not just corruption but deeply ingrained prejudices. Catherine Preston's Neighborhood Watch Group had evolved into an unofficial surveillance operation documenting every movement of suspicious individuals, all of whom happened to be people of color. Their reports, cross-referenced with arrest records, revealed a pattern of targeted harassment. The turning point came when Barrett discovered links between Thompson Diagnostic Services and a series of overdose deaths. The lab hadn't just been falsifying drug tests, it had been processing and cutting seized drugs for redistribution. The same facility that had produced Jamal's false positive had been at the center of the operation for years. Eleanor's hands shook as she reviewed Barrett's findings. "This goes beyond corruption," she said. "This is mass murder for profit. And my own son," her voice broke, but her eyes remained fierce. Sarah reached across the table and took her hand. "You taught me something, Eleanor. Justice isn't just about the law, it's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." Jamal, sitting at the piano, began playing softly a jazz improvisation on Amazing Grace that filled the room with both sorrow and hope. The three of them sat in silence, listening to the music and understanding that they had crossed a point of no return. That evening, as Jamal helped Eleanor organize the final pieces of evidence, she suddenly grabbed his arm. "Promise me something," she said urgently. "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll see this through. Not for revenge, but for justice. For all the families like yours who didn't have anyone to fight for them." "I promise," Jamal replied, understanding somehow that this was more than just a moment, it was a passing of the torch. None of them could have known that within 24 hours, everything would change. The carefully gathered evidence, the witness statements, the financial records, all of it was about to explode into the open in a way none of them had planned. And Oakwood Heights would never be the same. The crisis erupted on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning. Eleanor Thompson was found unconscious in her study, her breath shallow, her pulse weak. The hidden compartments in her bookshelves stood empty, their contents spread across her antique desk. She had worked through the night, organizing evidence for a meeting with federal investigators scheduled for that afternoon. Sarah Richardson, arriving early to help prepare for the meeting, found her. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but news of Eleanor's collapse spread even faster. By the time Jamal rushed to the hospital from the safe house, Michael Thompson was already there, playing the role of concerned son perfectly. "I'm taking charge of my mother's care," he announced to the medical staff, his voice carrying the weight of his position, "and I'll need access to her house to secure any sensitive legal documents." But Eleanor Thompson, even in her weakened state, had planned for this moment. As Michael moved to leave for her house, Detective Barrett stepped out of the shadows, warrant in hand. "Actually, Mr. Thompson, that property is now a crime scene. We have reason to believe it contains evidence of multiple federal violations." The look that crossed Michael's face, a flicker of rage beneath his polished exterior, would haunt Jamal for years to come. Detective Michael said smoothly, "Whatever game you're playing, remember who signs your department's budget." "That would be concerning," Barrett replied. If this was still a local investigation, he gestured to two individuals who had been quietly observing. Special Agents Carter and Rodriguez, FBI Public Corruption Task Force. They're very interested in Thompson Diagnostic Services' connection to recent overdose deaths. The hospital corridor became a battlefield of legal threats and jurisdictional claims. Michael's phone buzzed constantly as he tried to contain the situation, but it was already too late. Eleanor's evidence had been secured hours earlier, digitized and distributed to multiple federal offices. In her hospital room, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness. During one lucid moment, she gripped Jamal's hand. "The piano bench," she whispered, "false bottom. The real evidence, Marcus's case." Jamal's heart raced. He caught Sarah's eye and she nodded slightly. While Michael was occupied with the federal agents, she slipped away from the hospital. Barrett dispatched two trusted officers to escort her to Eleanor's house. The scene that greeted them was chaos. Crime scene technicians photographed everything, while federal agents boxed up documents. In the music room, Sarah moved to the piano bench. The false bottom revealed a thumb drive and a handwritten confession from one of the officers involved in Marcus's arrest, dated just 3 days earlier. But they weren't alone in the house. Catherine Preston, conducting her usual surveillance, had seen Sarah enter. Within minutes, a crowd of concerned citizens gathered outside, their phones recording every movement. Among them were faces Jamal recognized from the country club's backroom meetings. The tension escalated when Michael Thompson suddenly appeared, having somehow slipped away from the hospital. "Mrs. Richardson," he called out, his voice carrying across the lawn, "I believe you're trespassing." "Officers, this woman has no right to be in my mother's house." Several local police officers moved forward, but Barrett's team stood firm. The confrontation seemed poised to turn violent when a new voice cut through the chaos. "Actually, she has every right to be there." Eleanor Thompson, pale but upright, was being helped from a car by hospital staff. Against medical advice, she had discharged herself, because as of this morning, Sarah Richardson is my legal executor. The crowd fell silent. Michael's carefully maintained facade cracked. "Mother, you're not thinking clearly. You need to return to the hospital." "What I need," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength, "is to finish what I started. Detective Barrett, I believe you'll find everything you need in my study, including—" She fixed Michael with a steel gaze, "records of every case where Thompson Diagnostic Services falsified evidence to secure convictions." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Federal agents swarmed the property. Michael Thompson was taken in for questioning. Catherine Preston and her group were dispersed by FBI agents documenting attempts at witness intimidation. But the real drama was unfolding in Eleanor's study, where Sarah discovered something even Eleanor hadn't known existed: a recorded conversation between Michael and the officers who had arrested Marcus Richardson, discussing how to plant evidence and ensure a conviction. "He was getting too close," Michael's voice said on the recording. "His maintenance job at the hospital, he was seeing things he shouldn't. Make it clean, make it stick." The revelation hit Jamal like a physical blow. His father hadn't just been innocent, he had been deliberately silenced. The truth they had been fighting for was darker than any of them had imagined. As rain continued falling over Oakwood Heights, Eleanor Thompson sat in her study one last time, watching federal agents box up evidence of her son's crimes. Sometimes she told Jamal softly. Justice comes at a terrible price. But the alternative, staying silent, letting evil triumph, that price is even higher. The day wasn't over yet. As evening approached, news vans began arriving, drawn by rumors of a major corruption scandal. But the biggest shock was still to come, and it would change everything, not just for Jamal's family, but for the entire community. The confrontation that everyone had been dreading finally erupted during the emergency city council meeting called that evening. The council chambers were packed. Reporters, community members, families of convicted individuals, and a heavy police presence. Michael Thompson's allies on the council had attempted to prevent the meeting, but public pressure had become too intense to ignore. Eleanor Thompson, against her doctor's orders, insisted on testifying. Seated in her wheelchair, her voice weak but unwavering, she began methodically laying out the evidence of systematic corruption. She detailed how drug evidence was being recycled through Thompson Diagnostic Services, how seized assets were being funneled into private accounts, and how innocent people, primarily from minority communities, were being framed to boost conviction rates. "My son," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "turned our justice system into a personal profit machine. Every false conviction, every seized property, every ruined life, it all fed into his power and wealth." The council chamber erupted in chaos when Michael Thompson himself strode in, flanked by his attorneys. "Mother," his voice cut through the noise, "you're clearly unwell. These delusional accusations are supported by extensive evidence." Detective Barrett interrupted, stepping forward with a thick folder, "including your own recorded conversations about Marcus Richardson's case." What followed was a scene that would be talked about in Oakwood Heights for years to come. Michael, realizing his carefully constructed world was crumbling, finally lost his composure. "You want to talk about corruption?" he shouted. "Let's talk about how this city really works. Every person in this room has benefited from our system. Your property values, your safe streets, your prestigious schools, all maintained by keeping certain elements out." His words hung in the air, laying bare the ugly truth that many had preferred to ignore. Catherine Preston and her group shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Michael continued his rant, exposing the implicit bias that had allowed his corruption to flourish. But then Jamal stood up, his voice clear and strong. "I'd like to play something," he said, wheeling a keyboard that had been set up for another presentation. "Something Mrs. Thompson taught me." Before anyone could object, he began playing a haunting jazz arrangement of Amazing Grace that filled the chamber. The melody, transformed through minor keys and complex harmonies, spoke of both pain and redemption. As he played, Sarah Richardson read from the newly discovered evidence about her husband's case. The music underscored each revelation: how Marcus had discovered the hospital's connection to the drug trade, how he had been framed to silence him, how evidence had been planted and witnesses coerced. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as the full impact of her son's crimes became clear. Michael, watching his mother's face, finally seemed to break. "I didn't start this," he said quietly. "I inherited it. But I made it better, more efficient. Everything I did was to maintain order." "Order?" Eleanor's voice was steel. "You mean control. You perverted everything your father and I taught you about justice." The federal agents chose that moment to make their move. As Jamal's music reached its crescendo, they began making arrests, not just Michael, but several council members, police officers, and prominent citizens who had been complicit in the scheme. Catherine Preston, seeing the writing on the wall, stepped forward with her own evidence, detailed records of how the neighborhood watch had been used to target specific individuals for police harassment. Her hands shook as she handed over her phone. "I thought we were protecting our community," she whispered. The meeting lasted late into the night. More people came forward with testimonies of how the corruption had affected their lives. Plans were made for reviewing hundreds of suspicious convictions. A special committee was formed to oversee reforms in the police department and court system. But the most powerful moment came when Eleanor Thompson, exhausted but determined, made her final statement. "Justice isn't about maintaining order," she said. "It's about protecting truth and human dignity. Today we begin the hard work of making that real for everyone in our community." As the meeting finally adjourned, Jamal helped wheel Eleanor out into the cool night air. The media lights and cameras created a surreal atmosphere as reporters clamored for statements. But above the chaos, they could hear something unexpected: people singing Amazing Grace. led by some of the families whose loved ones had been wrongly convicted. The song spread through the crowd, a spontaneous moment of healing and hope. Even some of Catherine Preston's former group joined in, their voices hesitant but present. It was a small step but a significant one toward bridging the divides that had allowed corruption to flourish. But as they drove home that night, past the federal agents still gathering evidence at Eleanor's house, past the news vans and gathered crowds, they knew that the hardest part of their journey was still to come. Justice had been set in motion, but healing would take much longer. And somewhere in Sterling State Penitentiary, Marcus Richardson was about to receive news that would change his life forever. As Eleanor and Jamal's story unfolds, I feel incredibly moved to share more powerful tales of justice and redemption with you. If their courage touched your heart, consider subscribing to join our storytelling family. Together we can discover more stories that inspire change and hope. Eleanor Thompson's condition deteriorated rapidly in the days following the council meeting. The stress of the confrontation, combined with her already weakened state, took its toll. Doctors at Oakwood Heights Memorial spoke in hushed tones about heart failure and limited time. Yet she refused to rest, working from her hospital bed to help federal investigators unravel decades of corruption. Her room became a makeshift office, with Barrett and the FBI agents bringing documents for her review. Each new revelation seemed to age her further, especially as the full scope of Michael's crimes became clear. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," she confided to Jamal during one of his daily visits. Her voice was weaker now, but her eyes remained sharp. A mother should know her child better. Jamal had taken to bringing his keyboard to the hospital, playing softly while Eleanor worked. The medical staff noted how her vital signs improved during these impromptu concerts. Other patients would leave their rooms to listen, drawn by the melodies that somehow captured both sorrow and hope. The tragedy deepened when Michael Thompson, facing mounting evidence, attempted to negotiate a plea deal by implicating others. His list of conspirators included judges, politicians, and business leaders, many of whom had been Eleanor's friends and colleagues. Each name was like a physical blow to her already failing heart. "He's trying to save himself by destroying everything we built," she whispered to Sarah one evening. "The worst part is I'm not even surprised anymore." The media circus outside the hospital grew as more details of the scandal emerged. Reporters camped out in the parking lot, hoping to catch anyone coming or going from Eleanor's room. Some painted her as a hero exposing corruption, others suggested she was a bitter mother destroying her son's career. The true blow came when Eleanor suffered a major heart attack while reviewing a particularly devastating piece of evidence, proof that Michael had deliberately blocked appeals from wrongfully convicted defendants, ensuring they died in prison before their cases could be reopened. "Code Blue, room 415, the announcement echoed through the hospital corridors. Jamal, who had been playing piano in the hospital chapel, ran up 4 flights of stairs, his heart pounding in rhythm with his footsteps. He arrived to find medical staff working frantically to stabilize her. Sarah held him back as they watched through the glass. "Let him work," she whispered, though her own voice shook. They had both grown to love Eleanor deeply. Over the past months she had become family in a way that transcended blood ties. Eleanor survived the heart attack, but emerged significantly weakened. The doctors were clear she needed complete rest, no more involvement in the investigation. Yet even in this state she remained focused on her mission. "Jamal," she called to him weakly after the doctors left. "The piano bench. There's something else hidden there. A letter. For Marcus. I wrote it years ago after I began suspecting, but I was too cowardly to send it." Detective Barrett retrieved the letter that evening. Its contents would later prove crucial in expediting Marcus Richardson's release, but the emotional cost was devastating. Eleanor had written a full confession of her doubts during the trial, her growing suspicions about her son, and her deep remorse for not acting sooner. "I failed as a judge," she told Jamal, tears sliding down her pale cheeks. "I failed as a mother, but maybe through you I can still do something right." That night, as Jamal played softly in her room a gentle rendition of What a Wonderful World, Eleanor Thompson slipped into unconsciousness. The monitors beeped steadily, but everyone knew she was fighting her final battle. Outside her window, an unexpected scene unfolded. People began gathering in the hospital parking lot, families of the wrongfully convicted, community members, even some former critics. They held candles, singing hymns and spirituals that floated up to her window. Catherine Preston was among them, her neighborhood watch group now holding signs calling for justice reform. The transformation of their community was beginning, but the price was proving heartbreakingly high. As midnight approached, Jamal continued playing, his music a bridge between life and whatever lay beyond. Sarah stood by the window watching the growing crowd below, understanding that they were witnessing both an ending and a beginning. None of them could know that Eleanor Thompson still had one final card to play, one last act of justice that would shake Oakwood Heights to its core. Eleanor Thompson passed away at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning as the first hints of dawn began to color the sky. Jamal had fallen asleep at his keyboard, his fingers still poised over the keys. Sarah was dozing in a chair by the bed. The monitor's steady beeping simply stopped. But Eleanor's death was not the end. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. Hours before she passed, she had signed a series of documents that Barrett had brought to her room. Her final testimony, legally recorded and notarized, named names and provided details that even the federal investigation hadn't uncovered. She knew Barrett told them later. She knew she was dying, so she made sure every word was admissible in court. Right until the end, she was thinking like a judge. The media descended on Oakwood Heights Memorial like vultures. Michael Thompson, out on bail, arrived in an expensive suit, playing the role of grieving son perfectly for the cameras. But when he tried to enter her room, hospital security stopped him. Eleanor's final instructions had been explicit about who could and couldn't access her body or personal effects. The next blow came at the reading of her will. Eleanor had changed it just days before her death, naming Sarah Richardson as her executor and Jamal as the primary beneficiary of her estate. More importantly, she had left detailed instructions about how her evidence was to be used in the event of my death. The lawyer read from Eleanor's final instructions. All documents in my possession are to be immediately transferred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with copies to be made public through specified media outlets. No plea deals are to be offered to any parties named in these documents without full confession and restitution to their victims. Michael Thompson's face turned ashen as the implications became clear. His mother had ensured that her death would not stop the investigation. In fact, she had made it impossible for anyone to sweep it under the rug. The funeral drew hundreds of people, creating a stark visual representation of Oakwood Heights' transformation. Wealthy residents in designer clothes stood alongside families of the wrongfully convicted. Catherine Preston and her former neighborhood watch members found themselves sharing pews with people they had once reported as suspicious. Jamal was asked to play at the service. He chose a piece he had composed himself, weaving together themes from the classical music Eleanor had taught him with the jazz his father had loved. The music spoke of loss and hope, justice and mercy, endings and beginnings. But the deepest cut came during the eulogy, when Sarah Richardson stood to speak. She read from Eleanor's final letter to the community, words that would later be carved on her tombstone. Justice is not merely the absence of corruption, but the active presence of truth. I failed to see that truth when it mattered most, and others paid the price for my blindness. Let my final act be to restore not just the law, but the humanity we have lost along the way. The letter went on to detail how her entire fortune was to be used to establish a legal fund for wrongfully convicted individuals and their families. The Thompson mansion would be converted into a community center, focusing on racial reconciliation and legal education. As they lowered Eleanor's casket into the ground, Jamal noticed something extraordinary. The gathered crowd, diverse in every way imaginable, had joined hands spontaneously. The barriers that had divided Oakwood Heights for so long seemed, at least in that moment, to have crumbled. But there was no time to dwell on this symbolic victory. Even as the last mourners departed the cemetery, events were unfolding that would bring both justice and danger. Eleanor's death had set in motion forces that neither Michael Thompson nor his conspirators could control. And in his cell at Sterling State Penitentiary, Marcus Richardson received a thick envelope containing Eleanor's personal confession about his case, along with evidence that would finally set him free. The note attached, in Eleanor's shaky handwriting, read simply, "I'm sorry it took me so long to find my courage. Your son helped me find it." The tragedy of Eleanor Thompson's death was profound, but as Jamal would later realize, some sacrifices echo far beyond their immediate loss. The real question was, would Oakwood Heights learn from her final lesson? The revelation began with a phone call at midnight. Detective Barrett's voice was urgent. "Turn on your TV. Channel 7, now." Sarah and Jamal, still staying in the safe house, watched in stunned silence as the story unfolded. Thompson Diagnostic Services had been more than just a drug testing facility. It had been the central hub of a massive criminal enterprise. The FBI raid had uncovered evidence of not just falsified drug tests, but a sophisticated operation for redistributing seized drugs back onto the streets. But the true bombshell came from an unexpected source. Catherine Preston, perhaps seeking redemption, had come forward with years of surveillance footage from her neighborhood watch program. The seemingly overzealous community monitoring had accidentally documented countless suspicious meetings, mysterious deliveries, and late-night exchanges at the country club. "We thought we were protecting our community," Preston told reporters, her voice shaking. "Instead, we were helping them target their victims. Every suspicious person report, every call to the police, we were doing their dirty work." The footage showed Michael Thompson meeting regularly with a network of corrupt officials. More disturbingly, it revealed how Marcus Richardson had stumbled upon their operation. Security cameras at the hospital where he worked had captured him witnessing a late-night drug exchange, the same cameras that had mysteriously malfunctioned the night of his arrest. Eleanor Thompson had known some of this before her death, but not everything. Her final instructions led investigators to a hidden safe in her library, containing decades of meticulously documented suspicions and evidence. She had been building her case for years, waiting for the right moment, or perhaps for the right allies. "Your mother's surveillance wasn't just about protecting property values," Barrett explained to Michael Thompson during his final interrogation. "She was gathering evidence against you, against all of you. Every dinner party, every charity gala, she was documenting everything." The scope of the corruption staggered the community. Judges who had signed off on suspicious warrants, police officers who had planted evidence, property developers who had profited from seized assets. The web of complicity stretched through every level of Oakwood Heights society. But the most damning evidence came from Eleanor's personal diary, discovered in the false bottom of her jewelry box. In it, she documented her growing horror as she pieced together her son's involvement, her struggle with her conscience, and her determination to make things right. "I failed Marcus Richardson," she had written. "I failed every defendant who came before me believing in justice. My silence made me complicit. But through Jamal, I found my courage again. Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places." The diary entries stopped abruptly on the day of her heart attack, but her final entry was clear: Michael must be stopped. The truth must come out. Even if it cost me everything, even if it cost me my life. As the evidence mounted, the carefully maintained facade of Oakwood Heights began to crack. Prominent families, seeing the writing on the wall, began turning on each other. Michael Thompson's former allies rushed to make deals with prosecutors, each revelation more damning than the last. For Jamal, watching this unfold from the safe house, the truth brought mixed emotions. Vindication for his father came with the knowledge that an entire community had been complicit in his wrongful imprisonment. The system hadn't just failed, it had been deliberately corrupted. "Your father wasn't their only victim," Barrett told him, "but he might have been the one that finally brought them down. His case was their biggest mistake because it led us to you and you to Eleanor." The revelations continued to cascade. Bank records showed massive transfers to offshore accounts. Evidence lockers had been systematically pilfered. Cases had been fixed, witnesses intimidated, lives destroyed, all to maintain what Michael Thompson had called order. But Eleanor Thompson had left one final surprise, one that would change everything, not just for the Richardson family, but for every family affected by the corruption. Her last act of justice was about to be revealed, and its impact would reverberate through Oakwood Heights for generations to come. In her hospital room, hours before her death, she had recorded a final testimony. The video, now in FBI possession, would tear away the last vestiges of doubt about the truth she had died to expose. Eleanor Thompson's final testimony played on screens throughout the federal courthouse, her voice weak but resolute. Her face, gaunt from illness, still commanded attention as she methodically laid out decades of corruption, naming names and providing details that only an insider could know. My son, she said, looking directly into the camera, didn't create this system of injustice. He inherited it, embraced it, and perfected it. But its roots go deeper into the very foundations of Oakwood Heights, into the prejudices we pretend don't exist. The evidence was irrefutable. Bank records revealed a complex network of payoffs and bribes. Eleanor had tracked every transaction, every connection, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss. But her most damning revelation came near the end of her testimony. The Richardson case wasn't random, she explained. Marcus was targeted because he discovered something during his maintenance rounds at the hospital. There was a pattern to which rooms were used after hours, which judges signed specific warrants, which officers made certain arrests. He didn't know what he was seeing, but they couldn't risk him figuring it out. The dominoes began to fall. Judge Harrison, who had taken over many of Eleanor's cases after her retirement, was arrested during a morning session. 3 senior police officers turned state's evidence. Catherine Preston provided years of surveillance footage that, viewed through new eyes, documented countless suspicious meetings and exchanges. But the most stunning reversal came when Michael Thompson himself, facing overwhelming evidence, finally broke. In a plea deal that would shake Oakwood Heights to its core, he revealed how the corruption had started decades ago with his own father, Eleanor's late husband. Thomas Thompson wasn't just a civil rights lawyer, Michael testified. He discovered the corruption in his fight for justice, but instead of exposing it, he saw an opportunity. He built relationships with the very people he claimed to be fighting against. When he died, I inherited those connections. I told myself I was maintaining order, protecting our way of life. But my mother, she never stopped fighting for real justice. The revelation stunned everyone, especially Eleanor's supporters. But Barrett discovered something else in her file's evidence, that she had suspected the truth about her husband for years. Her quest for justice hadn't just been about correcting her son's crimes, it had been about confronting her own family's legacy of corruption. Marcus Richardson's release from prison was expedited. The scene outside Sterling State Penitentiary, captured by dozens of news cameras, showed him emerging into sunlight, embracing Sarah and Jamal for the first time in 8 years. But it was his words that captured headlines. "I don't want revenge," he told reporters. "I want change, real change. And thanks to Eleanor Thompson, we might finally have a chance at that." The impact rippled through the community. The prestigious Oakwood Heights Country Club, central to so many corrupt dealings, was converted into a community center. Thompson Diagnostic Services assets were seized and redirected into a fund for wrongfully convicted individuals. The Neighborhood Watch program was completely restructured, with oversight from civil rights organizations. Catherine Preston, in an unexpected turn, became one of the strongest advocates for reform. "We were complicit in our silence," she admitted during a community meeting, "but we can be equally powerful in our determination to make things right." The final piece of justice came in the form of a new legal clinic established in Eleanor's name, dedicated to reviewing suspicious convictions. Staffed by law students and overseen by reformed judges, it became a model for similar programs across the country. Jamal, watching his father adjust to freedom while helping other families seek justice, understood finally what Eleanor had meant about music and truth. Some harmonies take time to resolve, some discords need to be faced before healing can begin. The truth had indeed set them free, but it had also given them a responsibility. As Eleanor had written in her final diary entry, justice isn't a destination, it's a journey we must choose to make every day, in every decision, with every action. And in Oakwood Heights, that journey was finally truly beginning. 1 year after Eleanor Thompson's death, Oakwood Heights had transformed in ways few could have imagined. The former Thompson Mansion, now the Eleanor Thompson Center for Justice and Reconciliation, buzzed with activity. Law students worked alongside community advocates, reviewing cases and providing free legal assistance. The grand piano in the music room, where Jamal had first learned to play, remained at the heart of the building. Marcus Richardson, fully exonerated and compensated for his wrongful imprisonment, chose to work at the center rather than pursue a larger settlement. "Money can't buy back lost years," he explained to visitors, "but it can help prevent others from losing theirs." His expertise in maintenance proved invaluable as he helped transform other seized properties into community resources. Sarah Richardson left her custodial job to manage the center's outreach programs. Her intimate knowledge of both worlds, the struggling families and the wealthy community, helped bridge divides that had seemed insurmountable. Under her guidance, the center became a model for similar programs across the state. Jamal, now a high school senior, continued playing at the center every afternoon. His music became a symbol of healing, drawing people together in ways that words couldn't. College music programs were already expressing interest, but he had different plans. He wanted to study both music and law, carrying forward Eleanor's legacy in his own unique way. The changes in Oakwood Heights went beyond the surface. Property values had initially dropped when the scandal broke, causing panic among longtime residents. But something unexpected happened as the community became more inclusive. It grew richer in other ways. New businesses opened, cultural events flourished, and a genuine sense of community began to emerge. Catherine Preston's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable. The former neighborhood watch leader now headed the center's community relations department, working tirelessly to combat the very prejudices she had once enforced. Her detailed records, once used to monitor suspicious individuals, became evidence in dozens of wrongful conviction cases. Michael Thompson's trial concluded with a 30-year sentence, but his cooperation led to larger investigations across the state. Other communities began examining their own systems, uncovering similar patterns of corruption. Eleanor's methodical documentation became a blueprint for reform efforts nationwide. Detective Barrett, promoted to head a new civil rights division, made the center his base of operations. Eleanor Thompson showed us that justice isn't just about enforcing laws, he often said. It's about transforming communities. The old country club, its membership dwindled after the scandal, was purchased by the center and converted into a performing arts space. The back rooms where corrupt deals had been made became practice studios for young musicians. Jamal's jazz ensemble, made up of students from across the socioeconomic spectrum, performed there regularly. Even the hospital where Marcus had first discovered the corruption underwent changes. New oversight procedures were implemented, and a whistleblower protection program was established. The late-night activities that had once led to his arrest were replaced by legitimate community health initiatives. But perhaps the most profound change was in the daily life of Oakwood Heights. Children from different backgrounds played together in parks that had once been effectively segregated. Community meetings became forums for genuine dialogue rather than exercises in exclusion. The surveillance cameras that had once monitored suspicious activity were repurposed to protect public spaces that everyone now shared. Eleanor Thompson's grave became an unexpected symbol of this transformation. People left flowers, notes, and small tokens of appreciation. But more importantly, they left promises, commitments to continue the work she had started. On the anniversary of her death, Jamal played at a memorial service held in the center's garden. As his music filled the air, Marcus and Sarah watched their son with pride, understanding that Eleanor's legacy lived on not just in the buildings and programs that bore her name, but in the changed hearts and minds of a community. The journey wasn't over. Real change never is. But Oakwood Heights had learned perhaps the most important lesson Eleanor Thompson had tried to teach: that justice, like music, requires harmony between different parts, each contributing its own unique voice to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The final notes of Jamal's memorial performance faded into the evening air, but their impact resonated through the gathered crowd. He had composed a new piece, titled Eleanor's Legacy, weaving together classical themes with jazz improvisation, a musical representation of the bridges being built in their community. Marcus Richardson stood at the podium, his years of imprisonment etched in his face, but his eyes bright with purpose. Eleanor Thompson taught us that justice isn't just about righting wrongs, he said. It's about creating a world where those wrongs become impossible. Sarah, standing beside her husband, squeezed his hand as he continued. The past year had brought their family full circle, from victims to advocates, from outcasts to community leaders. Their story had become a beacon of hope for others fighting similar battles. The Eleanor Thompson Center had already helped overturn 12 wrongful convictions, with dozens more cases under review. But its impact went beyond legal victories. Weekly community dialogues brought together people who had once viewed each other with suspicion. Former prosecutors sat alongside reformed activists, sharing insights about how to prevent future injustices. Catherine Preston, who had once led efforts to exclude families like the Richardsons, now worked alongside them. Her transformation became a powerful testament to the possibility of change. Eleanor showed us that it's never too late to choose a different path, she often said during community outreach sessions. The center's music program, directed by Jamal, had become particularly symbolic. Young people from all backgrounds came together to learn and perform, their harmonies a living metaphor for the community they were building. The practice rooms, once filled with the echoes of corrupt dealings, now resonated with hope. Michael Thompson, serving his sentence, had begun working with prison reform advocates. His insights into systemic corruption helped identify and address similar patterns in other jurisdictions. Though he couldn't undo his past actions, he had chosen to contribute to a better future. Detective Barrett, watching the memorial service from the back of the crowd, reflected on how one act of kindness, a young man helping an elderly woman with her groceries, had sparked a revolution of conscience. The ripples continued spreading, touching lives far beyond Oakwood Heights. The message was clear: change begins with individual choices, but it succeeds through collective action. Eleanor Thompson's legacy wasn't just in the buildings and programs that bore her name, but in the daily decisions of people choosing justice over convenience, understanding over prejudice, harmony over division. As the sun set over the transformed community, Jamal returned to the piano. This time he invited others to join him, young musicians he had mentored, representing the diversity of their new Oakwood Heights. Together, they created something that would have been impossible just a year ago, a spontaneous celebration of unity and difference. The final image of the evening captured the essence of their journey: Marcus and Sarah Richardson, standing with Catherine Preston and Detective Barrett, while Jamal's music filled the air. Behind them, Eleanor Thompson's portrait watched over the garden where a community had learned to grow together. The inscription beneath her portrait, taken from her final testimony, had become the center's guiding principle: justice is not a destination but a journey we take together. Every step toward understanding, every act of kindness, every choice to stand for what's right, these are the notes in the symphony of change. As night fell over Oakwood Heights, the music gradually faded, but its message lingered: that sometimes the greatest acts of justice begin with the smallest acts of kindness, that change is possible even in the most entrenched systems. And that harmony in music and in life comes from embracing rather than fearing our differences. The story of Jamal, Eleanor, and the transformation of Oakwood Heights would be told and retold, not as a tale of tragedy and revenge, but as a testament to the power of truth, courage, and the enduring human capacity for change. In the end, that was Eleanor Thompson's greatest legacy, not just exposing corruption, but showing how justice and reconciliation could grow from the same soil. Dear friends, Eleanor and Jamal's journey has touched us all deeply. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to support our storytelling team. Every subscription helps us bring more powerful narratives to life. Share this video with your loved ones who believe in justice and redemption. Your likes and comments mean the world to us, and we'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. Should we continue exploring the aftermath of Oakwood Heights transformation in Part 2? Let us know in the comments below. Together we can keep sharing stories that inspire change. Don't forget to hit that like button and ring the notification bell.